12 hours to Kereth 4, and the briefing was already over. Foss had packed the operation into 9 slides. Population density maps, infrastructure grids, a compliance forecast with a 40-hour window. Standard Category 0 package. I signed the final authorization on the tactical display and watched the fleet deployment graphic blink green across 42 ship markers, each one holding formation in the transit corridor like beads on a wire. Governance teams are staged on the Harwell and the Broad River, Drayton said, scrolling through the logistics manifest on his display. 1,200 personnel, administrative, medical, engineering. We can begin integration landings within 6 hours of compliance confirmation. I nodded. The Kereth were herbivorous, agrarian, and had never developed so much as a projectile weapon. The Terran Expansion Bureau's classification file ran 60 pages, 58 of them agricultural surveys and atmospheric data. 2 pages covered the species itself. Category 0, a civilization without military structure, orbital capability, or a history of organized violence. The subjugation of a Category 0 world was, in the Bureau's official language, an administrative incorporation. The word conquest appeared nowhere in the documentation. That word lived in older files. In the language of the expansion mandate, the legal and philosophical framework the Terran Parliament had ratified 40 years earlier to justify interstellar expansion, subjugation was protection. The logic was simple. The galaxy held predatory species. Undefended worlds were prey. The Terran Empire extended governance over vulnerable civilizations to prevent their destruction by unprincipled forces. Whether those civilizations wanted that governance was, under the mandate, irrelevant. A child does not consent to vaccination. I had used that analogy in 3 post-campaign briefings. It still held. This would be my 12th campaign. 22 years in Vanguard Command. 11 worlds incorporated under my authority, and the operational pattern had settled into a rhythm I could run from memory. Orbital demonstration first. A coordinated weapons discharge across the planet's upper atmosphere, visible from the ground, loud enough to rattle structures, calibrated to avoid casualties. Then the compliance broadcast in the native language, transmitted on every frequency the target species used. Then the waiting period, usually 6 to 30 hours, while the native government processed what it had seen and reached the conclusion the mandate had already reached for them. Then the landings, governance teams, infrastructure assessment, integration. My operational journal sat open on the arm of my command chair, a physical notebook, paper and binding, because I'd learned early that digital records could be edited by people above you in the chain of command, and paper could only be burned. I turned to the page I'd prepared for Kereth 4. Undated. The column headers were the same ones I'd used for every campaign. Compliance time, governance landing, integration phase, notable resistance. The last column had been empty for my previous 4 operations. General. Kehoe, my communications officer, stood at his station near the forward viewport. 23 years old, a lieutenant on his first Vanguard deployment, assigned to the sovereign precedent because his academy marks in xenolinguistics were the highest in his graduating class. He looked like someone who had trained for a job he had never seen performed. "The compliance broadcast is queued and ready for transmission on arrival," he said. "Pre-recorded, native language formatted. Do you want to review the phrasing?" "Is it the standard Bureau text?" "Word for word, sir." "Then I don't need to review it. The Bureau's linguists know their work." He hesitated. A small shift in his weight, a glance towards the display where Kereth population data scrolled in real time. 800 million individuals distributed across a temperate equatorial band, concentrated in coastal settlements built around tidal agriculture. "Something on your mind, Lieutenant?" "The population centers are dense, sir. If the atmospheric demonstration causes structural resonance in those coastal buildings, it won't. The discharge pattern is tuned for open sky visibility, and Foss has modeled the acoustic spread." I closed the journal. "Kehoe, I've done this 11 times. The demonstration is designed to terrify, and it does that well. It breaks windows at worst. The alternative is what happened on Dremen before the mandate existed. Do you know that history? The Krev annexation. The Krev found Dremen before we did. A pacifist world, similar to Kareth, defenseless. They spent 9 years stripping it. By the time a Terran survey vessel reached the system, the native population had been reduced by 80%. Forced labor, resource extraction, biological experimentation. 9 years. I let the number sit. What we do here takes 40 hours. At the end of it, the Kereth still have their cities, their farms, their children, and their lives. They lose sovereignty. That is the cost. Weigh it. Kehoe returned to his station. Whether the arithmetic convinced him or simply silenced him, the result was the same. Drayton appeared at my shoulder 20 minutes later, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Long-range sensors flagged something in the Kereth system. Thermal anomalies on the primary star. What kind of anomalies? Temperature fluctuations, localized, patterned. Foss says they don't match any standard stellar model, but he's classified them as natural until we get closer readings. Drayton paused. He put a monitoring detail on it. Low priority. Fine. Keep me updated if the pattern changes. Drayton nodded and moved back to his station. A star misbehaving was interesting, but stars misbehaved. Magnetic anomalies, convection irregularities, solar cycle fluctuations. 100 explanations belonged in an astrophysics journal and away from a tactical briefing. I turned back to the transit countdown. 11 hours, 40 minutes to Kereth 4. The fleet held formation. The compliance broadcast sat in its queue. My journal waited for its 12th entry. The fleet dropped out of transit at the system's outer boundary. Foss spoke before the transit haze cleared. General, the star is wrong. I was already at the forward viewport. Kereth Prime filled the lower third of the frame, a main sequence yellow dwarf, unremarkable in the survey data, the kind of star that belonged on a textbook cover. But the survey data was 6 months old, and the star before me bore no resemblance to that file. Massive, dark shapes moved near its surface. They were visible only because of what they displaced. Wherever they travelled, the photosphere parted around them, and brilliant arcs of plasma trailed behind their passage. The arcs stretched for what had to be millions of kilometres, curving and rippling with the shape's movement, dragged along like ceremonial trains of fire. 6 of them, each one pulling its own river of superheated gas across the face of the star. The bridge had gone quiet. 40 years of Terran expansion, and nothing in any contact archive looked like this. Foss, identification. Commander Neil Foss was already bent over the tactical analysis console, his fingers working across 3 displays. Unknown. No match in the Imperial database or the Bureau's Xeno catalogue. The shapes register as solid, or at least as regions of significantly higher density than the surrounding plasma. I'm getting mass readings that suggest compressed stellar material. Each one is approximately 400 kilometers across at its widest point. He looked up. Sir, they're moving against the star's rotation, meaning they're self-propelled, meaning they're dragging sections of a star behind them, and the star can't pull the material back. I activated the fleet-wide tactical channel. All ships, this is Vanguard Actual. Threat condition elevated to Category 3. Combat protocols active. Hold formation and await further instructions. Category 3. Species with system-scale capability. The designation had been used only twice in the mandate's history, both times for misidentified stellar phenomena. I hoped for a third. Kehoe, broadcast first contact protocols on all standard frequencies. Imperial diplomatic package. Transmitting now, sir. Kehoe's hands moved across his communications array. The first contact package was polite, formal, and beneath its diplomatic language, a demand. Identify yourself, state your intentions, and acknowledge Terran authority in this sector. Every species we'd contacted had responded to it, some with words, some with weapons, all within the framework the Empire understood. Power met power, and then one side yielded. Silence answered. Foss, Energy output. Give me a weapons equivalent comparison. I can give you an absurd one. Foss pulled up a comparison chart. The total energy being manipulated near that star right now, by those 6 objects alone, exceeds the combined weapons output of every Terran warship ever built, including the decommissioned ones. The ratio is approximately the difference between a campfire and the star itself. Nobody on the bridge spoke for several seconds. Then Kereth Prime changed. It happened in a region of the photosphere near the equator, between 2 of the moving shapes. The surface collapsed inward, a bowl of fire sinking into itself, the plasma folding and compressing into an unmistakable form. A hand. 5 extensions radiated from a central mass, each one hundreds of thousands of kilometers across, made of pure stellar absence. Blackness, where the star's light simply ceased. The hand held its form for 8 seconds. I counted them. Everyone on the bridge counted them. The hand closed into a fist, and Kereth Prime went dark in that region for a single, impossible heartbeat. Then it opened. The collapsed region exploded outward in a flare that reshaped the star's corona into a crown. 5 symmetrical peaks of plasma arcing above the photosphere, each one aimed at one of the 6 shapes. The shapes drifted into the crown's geometry and held position, cradled in arcs of solar fire. Their trailing rivers of plasma merged with the flare until the entire arrangement looked composed. Intentional, a display, a statement, a demonstration of what they could do to the thing that made this system possible. Drayton, my executive officer, was beside me. His face had lost color, but his voice held. Sir, recommendations. Withdraw, immediately. Regroup at the sector staging point and request a full contact bureau assessment. And the Kereth 4 operation? Postponed. Obviously. I looked at the crown of fire around the alien fleet, because that was what they were. I could stop pretending otherwise. Every instinct I had as a fleet commander told me to classify them, to sort them into a category the Empire had already built. They were powerful. Power was familiar. Power meant negotiation, war, or capitulation, and all 3 had procedures. But withdrawal from a Category 0 subjugation, walking away from a pacifist world because something frightened me, would trigger an automatic review of my command authority. 22 years. 11 campaigns. The mandate did not recognize fear as a tactical variable. If I withdrew without engagement, without evidence of a direct military threat to my fleet, Terran Central Command would see a general who broke formation over a light show. We hold position, I said. Foss, I want a threat analysis simulation. Model the alien capabilities based on the stellar manipulation data and find me constraints, energy costs, range limits, response times. If they can fold a star, there's a thermodynamic price. Find it. General, with respect, the energy differentials alone. Find the constraints, Commander. Everything has limits. Everything obeys rules. That is what we are here to determine. Foss turned back to his console. Drayton stayed beside me, and I could see the arithmetic running behind his eyes. The same calculation I'd just made, weighed differently. He would have withdrawn. I would remember that. On the forward viewport, the crown of fire burned above Kereth Prime, the 6 shapes rested inside it, and the compliance broadcast still sat in its queue, waiting to be delivered to a world we had come to take. The corruption started in the communications array. 40 minutes after the crown display, Kehoe reported the first anomaly. Fleet-wide command transmissions, orders sent from the sovereign precedent to the other 41 ships, were arriving with errors. Small ones. A word replaced here, a phrase transposed there. The signal integrity was clean. Kehoe verified the encryption, the carrier frequency, the routing protocols. Everything checked. The messages simply arrived, changed. Show me an example, I said. Kehoe pulled up a transmission log. I had sent a fleet-wide advisory 30 minutes earlier. Maintain combat readiness. Await tactical assessment. No engagement without direct authorization. The version that reached the Harwell said, "Maintain combat readiness. Await tactical assessment. No one will be given time to prepare." I stared at the last sentence. "That's not a technical error," Drayton said. I scanned it again. "No one will be given time to prepare." The syntax was too clean for noise corruption. The sentence had meaning, grammar, and intent. Someone, something, had rewritten my order between ships. "Check the other vessels, every transmission in the last hour." Kehoe worked fast. The results came back inside 5 minutes, and they were worse than the single example. Command transmissions across the fleet were degrading in a pattern that followed rank structure. My orders, the highest authority signals in the fleet, were the most corrupted. Drayton's were partially altered. Foss's tactical data transfers showed minor substitutions. Kehoe's routine communications logs were clean. "Whatever is doing this," Foss said from his tactical station, "it's targeting seniority." I opened my mouth to issue a fleet-wide alert. Standard language, something I'd said 100 times. "All ships, Vanguard actual, priority Alpha, communications integrity compromised, switch to backup encryption protocols." The words that came out were in a language I did not speak. I heard them leave my throat, felt my jaw and tongue forming sounds that did not belong to any language I'd ever learned, and the sentence I'd composed disintegrated into a cadence of syllables that rose and broke with the weight of a man begging. The voice was mine, my vocal cords, my breath, but the words belonged to someone else, someone desperate, someone asking for time. The bridge went still. "General?" Drayton took a half-step toward me. I tried again. A simpler order, just Drayton's name and a tactical instruction. "Drayton, activate backup comms." My mouth formed the first syllable of his name correctly, and then the rest of the sentence slid out from under me. What came instead was a transmission I recognized because I had listened to it 6 years ago during the Paleth campaign. A civilian administrator on Paleth, the 9th world I'd subjugated, had broadcast a final request to my fleet in the hours before compliance. He'd asked for 12 additional hours to evacuate a medical district, 900 patients dependent on equipment that could not be moved quickly. I had denied the request. Compliance timelines were non-negotiable under the mandate. Now that administrator's words came out of my mouth. His exact words in his exact cadence, with the specific crack of exhaustion in the vowels where his composure had fractured. I stood on my own bridge and heard myself plead for 12 more hours in a language the ship's computer would later identify as Palethic. "What?" Drayton started, and the same thing happened to him. His first word was his own. Everything after it belonged to someone else. The Gorith surrender. I recognized the phrasing from the official recording. Drayton was speaking the capitulation terms a Gorith negotiator had recited when I accepted that world's compliance 4 years earlier. The negotiator's voice had broken in the middle of the formal surrender, a hitch of grief preserved with perfect clarity. Drayton's voice hitched in the same place, on the same syllable, as if the break had been written into the words themselves. Foss tried to interface with the tactical system using a verbal command code. The code came back as a child's voice, high, careful, reciting numbers, census figures, population data from a district on Tanith, the 7th world, a civilization of engineers whose infrastructure we had repurposed for imperial use. The child was reading the number of people relocated during integration. The numbers were large, the child's pronunciation precise, and Foss's mouth kept moving until the full count was complete. Around the bridge, officers tried to speak and found themselves inhabited by other voices, other words. Every command phrase, every military term, every operational shorthand decayed on contact with the air into the archived language of people the Empire had conquered. The ship's records were being fed back through our throats. One officer read a property transfer document from Vashar, the 3rd world. Another delivered a schoolteacher's farewell address from Pelham, the 5th. The communications station played a soft, continuous loop of a dock worker from Marek, describing the sound of Terran engines over the harbour. Except Kehoe wasn't speaking, and the audio wasn't coming from his equipment. It was coming from the air near the forward viewport, where 3 figures now stood. They had arrived without sound or transition. Tall shapes, twice the height of any man on the bridge, made of compressed light. Their cores burned white gold, and their edges bent the space around them so that every nearby surface warped toward their bodies. The rank insignia on my shoulder pulled sideways, the metal straining against the fabric as if magnetized. Drayton's sidearm twisted in its holster, the barrel curving toward the nearest figure. Across the bridge, every piece of Imperial hardware, weapons, badges, rank markers, authorization chips, strained towards the silhouettes like iron toward a lodestone. 3 of them, standing at the edges of the command deck, motionless, silent. Their light cast shadows in reverse. It gathered nearby illumination toward their forms, dimming the bridge around them while they blazed. I addressed them. My voice was my own again. The corruption had paused, or I'd found a gap in it. I gave them my name, my rank, my authority under the Terran expansion mandate. I requested identification. I stated that the Kareth system was designated for incorporation under Imperial law, and that any interference with Terran operations constituted an act of aggression under the Contact Accords. The nearest silhouette turned towards me. The movement was slow, immense, weighted, the way a searchlight swivels, carrying the mass of all the darkness it displaces. The light at its core brightened, and something changed in my throat. A tightening, a rearrangement. I tried to give Drayton a tactical order. The first word formed correctly, and then the Palace administrator's voice replaced mine again, mid-syllable, and the order dissolved into a plea for mercy that I had dismissed 6 years earlier without standing up from my chair. On the bridge of my flagship, surrounded by the full arsenal of Vanguard Fleet 9, I begged for 12 hours I had already refused to give. I stopped talking. I pulled my command datapad from its mount and typed an order. All ships, withdraw to sector staging point. Immediate execution. The text rendered correctly. I showed the screen to Drayton, who scanned it and nodded. His own voice was still lost in the Gorith negotiator's formal grief, so he moved to the helm station without speaking and began inputting the withdrawal command manually. The helm console accepted his input. Then the display changed. The navigation interface vanished, and the screen began cycling through compliance timelines, one for each of my 11 campaigns, in chronological order. Dates, population figures, resistance metrics, all reading 0, integration phase durations, governance team deployments. The operational data of 22 years of conquest, presented in the same format I used in my journal, scrolling at a speed that forced Drayton to watch each entry register before the next one appeared. He could not override it. He could not close the display. The ship's systems were delivering testimony. I turned back to the 3 silhouettes. They stood where they had arrived. Every sensor on the bridge confirmed the same data. 0 weapons discharge, 0 signal interference, 0 physical contact. They occupied the space, and the room reorganized itself around their presence. Light bending, metal straining, voices breaking, systems bearing witness. They watched. Whatever they were, whatever force had reshaped a star into a crown and turned my fleet's language into an archive of grief, it stood on my bridge and watched me discover that I could not give an order without hearing what my orders had cost. Kehoe sat at his station, untouched. His communications equipment worked. His voice was his own. His rank was low enough that the corruption, if that was what it was, had nothing to use against him. He had never authorized a subjugation. He had never denied an evacuation request. He had never signed a compliance timeline. The words in his mouth were his because conquered voices had no claim on them yet. He looked at me, and I saw the question forming behind his eyes. The same question Drayton had already answered for himself. The question the silhouettes had answered with fire and light, and the careful, precise deployment of everything I had ever done. What happens now? I did not know. My journal sat open on the arm of my chair, the Kereth page still blank. The compliance broadcast still waited in its queue. The fleet held formation around a star that had been folded into a fist by something that did not need to destroy us, because destruction was not the point. My mouth tasted like the Palith administrator's consonants. The silhouettes burned at the edges of my command deck, and every insignia on every officer pulled toward them, as if rank itself wanted to leave us and go where the gravity was stronger. Foss pulled me off the bridge. He did it by hand, seized my elbow and steered me toward the corridor, because speaking would have cost him his voice again. Drayton followed without being guided. The three silhouettes remained where they stood. Pursuit would have been redundant. Foss brought us 2 decks down to the tactical simulation chamber, a shielded compartment built into the ship's interior hull. The chamber ran on an isolated processing core, air-gapped from the Sovereign Precedent's main systems, so classified wargames and strategic models could run without leaking to external networks. Foss typed his authorization code into the door panel, and the lock cycled open. He typed because none of us were willing to test our voices in the corridor. The codes worked. The door worked. The chamber's interior lighting came up clean and white, the first uncontaminated space I'd entered since the silhouettes arrived. Foss sealed the hatch behind us and moved to the primary console. The simulation chamber was small, 4 stations surrounding a central holographic projection field, roughly 3 meters across. The system could model fleet engagements, planetary defense scenarios, orbital logistics, and threat assessments at full sensor fidelity. I'd used it to plan 9 of my 11 campaigns. "I can talk in here," Foss said. His own voice, undistorted. The relief on his face lasted about 2 seconds before professional focus replaced it. "The chamber's processing core is physically disconnected from the ship's main network. Whatever is corrupting our communication shouldn't be able to reach this system." "Then we use it," I said. My words came out clean. My own syntax, my own cadence. The absence of the Palith administrator's voice was so sudden that it took a moment to trust. "Model the alien contact. Everything we recorded. Stellar manipulation signatures, energy output, the silhouette's physical composition. Build a threat profile and find constraints." Foss loaded the data. The simulation initialized, the holographic field warming to a pale blue standby glow. Drayton lowered himself into one of the stations and sat very still, staring at the projection field. The simulation began building its model. Stellar data populated the projection. Kereth Prime in miniature, its surface activity rendered in thermal overlay, the 6 alien shapes marked as density anomalies. The system cycled through standard threat assessment protocols, energy analysis, mass calculations, vector prediction, weapons equivalence modeling. For 11 seconds, the data behaved. Then the star disappeared from the projection, and a planet took its place. I knew it immediately. The coastline, the arrangement of land masses, the orbital parameters rendered in the display margin. Palith, the 9th world, my 9th campaign. "Foss, shut it down." "I'm trying." His hands moved across the console. The simulation ignored his inputs. The planet grew in the projection field, filling the chamber with topographic detail. Palith's equatorial medical district rendered at street level, individual buildings resolved with a precision the simulation should not have possessed. Our tactical surveys of Palith had mapped the district from orbit. This model showed window frames, door handles, the layout of hospital corridors, the color of wall tiles in a recovery ward. The perspective shifted. The overhead view dropped to ground level, and I was inside it. I was standing in a corridor that turned twice before reaching a ward full of occupied beds. My hands were longer than my own, narrower at the knuckles with a grey-green tint to the skin. I held a personal terminal, a palethic device, flat and warm, with text scrolling across its surface in characters I should not have been able to understand. I understood them. The terminal displayed a patient manifest. 916 names, each annotated with equipment dependencies, transfer risk assessments, and mobility classifications. 43 were marked in red. Critical. Equipment bound. Disconnection would cause cardiac failure within minutes. I knew these numbers because the man whose body I occupied had memorized them. He had reviewed them for the past 19 hours, since the Terran fleet entered orbit and the compliance demand arrived. His name was Aldesi Govanath, and he ran this district. He was 57 years old. His son collected sediment samples from the tidal flats east of the city and kept them in jars on a shelf in his dormitory. Aldesi knew the exact number of jars. He knew the colors of the sediment layers. He knew these things the way I knew the operational pattern of an orbital demonstration, because they were part of the structure of his life, and he carried them with him into every room he entered, including this one. Aldesi walked the corridor and checked the ward. The patients were quiet. Some watched him pass with an expression I recognized from every world I had taken, the stillness of someone waiting to be told what will happen to him. Aldesi stopped at a bed where an elderly man was connected to a perfusion machine through a port in his chest. The machine cycled nutrients and medication into his bloodstream on a 20-minute rotation. The port could be removed only after surgical preparation. Moving the machine required a dedicated power supply that 2 men could barely carry. There were 42 others like this one in the district. Aldesi had counted them personally. He reached his office, sat down, activated his communications terminal, and sent his request to the Terran fleet. 12 additional hours. Enough time to prepare the critical patients for transport. He stated the medical justification clearly, calmly, in the formal palethic register his training demanded for official correspondence. He included the patient count, the equipment specifications, the transport logistics. He offered to expedite all other aspects of compliance in exchange for the medical extension. The response came in 9 minutes. I knew it came in 9 minutes because Aldesi counted every one of them, sitting at his desk with the manifest open on his personal terminal and the perfusion machine cycling in the ward behind him. The response was in Terran Standard, 3 sentences stamped with the authorization code of Vanguard Fleet 9. Request denied. Compliance timeline is non-negotiable under expansion mandate protocols. Governance teams will provide medical support upon landing. Aldesi absorbed those sentences 4 times. He passed the phrase, medical support upon landing, and understood that the soldiers who would enter his district in 28 hours had never operated palethic perfusion equipment, had no training in palethic cardiac pharmacology, and would be carrying field kits designed for Terran physiology. He understood this. In the gap between medical support and the actual weight of a perfusion machine, he could see how many of the 43 critical patients would survive the transition. He put the terminal down. He placed his hands on the desk. He sat in his chair, in his office, in his medical district, on his planet, and absorbed the knowledge that his request had been processed and denied by a man who had never entered this building, never touched this equipment, never learned a single patient's name. A man who would record the outcome of the Paleth campaign in a notebook under the column header Notable Resistance and leave the entry blank, because nothing that happened to Aldesi Govanath's patients qualified under the mandate's definitions as resistance. The simulation cycled. The corridor vanished. I was somewhere dark, dense with bodies, and the language around me was Gorith, clipped, percussive, spoken in overlapping voices that carried the texture of a room full of people trying to understand something their culture had no framework for. I was the negotiator. My name was Edda Koss, and I had been selected to speak for my species because I was the only member of the governing council who had studied Terran communication patterns. I had been a linguist. Now I was standing in a broadcast chamber with a document my government had drafted overnight, terms of surrender for a species that had never fought a war and therefore had no formal language for capitulation. The words I was about to speak had been invented 12 hours ago. They borrowed grammar from commercial arbitration and funeral practice because those were the closest analogues the Gorith language possessed. I stood before the transmitter and spoke the words, and my voice broke in the middle of a clause about sovereignty transfer, because the clause used the Gorith word for gift, the only word the drafting committee could find that approximated ceding governance, and the word carried a cultural weight that could not survive the sentence it had been placed in. A gift in Gorith tradition required consent from both parties and carried an obligation of reciprocity. The clause I was speaking used the word to describe something taken under the threat of orbital weapons fire. The word broke in my mouth the way a bone breaks when bent past its design tolerance, and the broadcast captured the sound. I knew the recording would be archived in the Terran fleet systems and cited in post-campaign briefings as evidence that the Gorith had complied voluntarily. The simulation cycled again. Tanith. I was a construction supervisor named Bella Koss, standing on a seawall watching a Terran logistics team disassemble a tidal power station my grandfather had helped design. The station converted wave energy into a distributed current that powered 60,000 residences along the northern coast. The Terran team was removing its core components, wave converters, distribution couplings, resonance dampeners, and cataloguing each piece under the label recovered infrastructure material. The components would be shipped to a Terran staging depot and repurposed for colonial power grids elsewhere in the sector. The work order classified the operation as resource integration. Bella Koss stood on his sea wall and watched 3 generations of engineering knowledge pulled apart by men who had not asked what the station did or who it served, because the work order did not require them to ask, and the label on the shipping crate did not include the word home. Foss broke the simulation. He did it physically, shoved himself back from his station, lifted his chair, and drove it into the primary console. The projection field collapsed. The chamber went dark. The holographic ghosts of Palith, Gorith, and Tanith dissolved into dead air, and the 3 of us sat in a shielded room in the belly of a warship surrounded by the silence of 3 worlds that had been beaten into compliance. I was the first to speak. We need to get back to the bridge. This is a psychological weapon. It can be endured. Foss said nothing. He was breathing hard, gripping the arms of his ruined station. Drayton had not moved throughout the entire simulation. His eyes were open, fixed on the place where the projection had been, and when I said his name, he turned his head toward me. I stood and walked toward the hatch. My hands were moving at my sides. I became aware of the movement only when I looked down and saw my fingers tracing characters in the air. Small, precise motions, repetitive, shaped like palethic script. The evacuation request. Aldesi Govanath's 12-hour plea, written in the formal register the man had used because his training demanded it. My fingers traced the words, looped back to the beginning, and started again. I watched them do this 3 times before I closed my fists, pressed them against my thighs, and held them there. The bridge was the same. The 3 silhouettes stood at the edges of the command deck. The verbal corruption was still active. I could hear it in the sporadic bursts of alien language coming from officers at their stations, men trying to run diagnostics and producing fragments of surrender declarations from worlds they had helped subdue. The tactical display showed the fleet still in formation, every ship operational, every weapons system armed. The crown of fire still burned above Kerith Prime in the forward viewport. I crossed to Kehoe's station. He was the only officer on the bridge whose equipment still functioned normally, the only one whose voice came out as his own. "Lieutenant, I need you to transmit a hyperlight distress signal to Terran Central Command. Priority channel. My authorization code is in the system. Use it while it still registers." "What do I tell them, sir?" "First contact with an unclassified species demonstrating stellar-scale capabilities. Command staff communications compromised. Request immediate intelligence support and reinforcement." Kehoe transmitted. The signal left the ship. His console confirmed the handshake with the sector relay. Whether Central Command received it, Whether they would act on a distress call from a fleet that showed no physical damage was beyond my control. I turned to face the silhouettes. They had not moved since my return. The light of their bodies still warped the air around them, still pulled every piece of Imperial metal on the bridge in their direction. I spoke slowly, spacing each word, testing the gap in the corruption that had let me speak freely in the sealed chamber. I am General Arthur Morrow. I acknowledge your capability. I am requesting terms for withdrawal. The first sentence held. The second held. The third held. The fourth did not. The words slid away, and Aldesi Govanath's petition filled my mouth again. I stopped. The silhouettes moved. All three of them simultaneously, with a synchronization that suggested a single governing intelligence. They crossed the bridge toward me. The nearest one extended something that functioned like a limb, an arc of compressed light, brighter at the tip, tapering to a point that emitted heat I could feel from 2 meters away. The point touched the rank insignia on my left shoulder. The metal heated. I could feel it through the fabric, a clean, building warmth that passed through, painful, and kept climbing until the insignia separated from my uniform and floated upward, hovering at chest height between me and the silhouette. A Major General's star, Terran Vanguard Command. I had worn it for 8 years. Then the campaign ribbons, each one detached in sequence: Paleth, Gorith, Vashar, Pelham, Tanith, Marek, all 11, pulling free from the fabric as if the thread holding them had turned to vapor. They joined the star in the air, forming a slow orbit. Then the command authorization implant. The implant sat behind my right ear, a ceramic chip embedded in the bone during my promotion to general, keyed to my neural signature and required for any fleet-wide command authentication. It was part of my skull. It had been part of my skull for 8 years. It extracted itself with a wet, grinding separation that traveled through my jaw, down my neck, and into the base of my spine. A bead of blood ran behind my ear and dripped onto my collar. The chip floated upward and joined the other pieces. My sidearm twisted free of its holster. The barrel curved toward the silhouette's core as it rose. The command-grade threading in my uniform, conductive filaments woven into the fabric that carried my authorization transponder signal, unraveled from the cloth in long, fine lines, pulling free like sutures being removed. The uniform sagged where the threading had given it structure. What remained was plain cloth, standard shipboard weave, the kind issued to enlisted crew. The same process worked its way through Drayton and Foss. Drayton did not resist. He stood at the tactical station where I'd placed him and watched his insignia lift away from his body. Foss reached for his campaign ribbon as it detached, a reflex, and the metal seared his palm. He released it, cradling his hand against his chest, and the ribbon floated upward to join the growing arrangement. The pieces were not drifting at random. They were organizing themselves. 12 clusters formed in the air around me, each one positioned at eye level in a rough semicircle. I could identify them by their composition. The first cluster held my earliest campaign materials, authorization codes, commendation markers, the command threading from my first fleet-issue uniform, which I had not worn in 17 years but which had apparently been archived somewhere the silhouettes could reach. Each subsequent cluster corresponded to a campaign, in chronological order. Paleth was the 9th. The Kareth cluster, the 12th, held only the authorization code I had signed that morning during the briefing. One piece, the only mark I'd left on this campaign. The silhouettes positioned themselves behind the semicircle. They stood in the spaces between the floating clusters, their light illuminating the arrangement from behind so that every insignia, every chip, every thread cast a sharp silhouette of its own against the bridge deck. I was standing inside a tribunal made of my career. The judges were made of starlight, and the evidence was everything I had earned and worn and carried for 22 years. The arrangement supplied the verdict. Each cluster corresponded to the grief the simulation had forced into me. Paleth's medical district, Gorith's broken word, Tanith's disassembled seawall. 11 campaigns, 11 specific costs, measured in equipment that could not be moved, in words that could not survive their sentences, in power stations stripped for parts. My rank had authorized every one of those costs. Now the rank hung in the air, separated from my body, organized into the precise shape of what it had purchased. Across the bridge, Kehoe sat at his station. His uniform was intact. His communications implant still transmitted his voice without corruption. His sidearm sat in its holster at the correct angle. He was, by default, the highest functioning command authority on the Terran sovereign precedent. A 23-year-old lieutenant on his first deployment, untouched because he had nothing to answer for. I tried to tell him to take command. The words came out. The clearest sentence I had spoken since the silhouettes arrived. And I heard the difference. The corruption had not garbled the sentence because the sentence carried no authority to corrupt. I was asking. The command structure that had made my voice an instrument of fleet-wide obedience was floating in pieces around my head. What came out of my mouth was a request from a man in a ruined uniform, standing inside the rubble of his own career, speaking to a junior officer who had every reason to refuse. Kehoe heard it. Every officer still conscious on the bridge heard it. The quality of the sound had changed. My voice was mine again, fully, permanently, and it carried nothing. The silhouettes departed the way they had arrived, without transition. One moment, they blazed at the edges of the bridge. The next, the space they had occupied was empty. The light in the room returned to its normal distribution. The air lost the warped, bent quality that had made every surface lean toward them. The 12 clusters of insignia dropped to the deck in a scatter of metal and ceramic and thread. The verbal corruption stopped across the fleet. Kerith Prime, visible through the forward viewport, burned as a stable yellow dwarf. The crown formation gone, the alien shapes absent from its surface. The star looked the way it had in the 6-month-old survey file. Unremarkable. Foss ran a systems diagnostic from the secondary tactical station, keeping his burned hand pressed against his side. The report came back. Engines operational, weapons online, navigation functional, life support nominal, communications restored across all 42 ships. The fleet was intact. Every hull, every drive, every reactor, undamaged. From an engineering standpoint, nothing had happened. The sovereign precedent could resume the Kerith 4 operation within hours. I stood at the forward viewport and looked at the approach vector on the tactical display. The planet was right there. The subjugation plan was loaded. The compliance broadcast sat in its queue, formatted and ready. The governance teams waited aboard the Harwell and the Broad River. Everything was in place. All I had to do was give the order, and now I could give it. My voice was mine. The corruption was gone. The silhouettes had taken my insignia, but left my vocal cords. I opened my mouth to authorize the compliance broadcast, and Aldesi Govanath's medical district filled my vision. The recovery ward. The perfusion machine cycling on its 20-minute rotation. The elderly man connected through the port in his chest. The 43 names marked in red. The 9 minutes of silence between the request and the denial. The gap between medical support and the actual weight of a man who could not be unplugged without dying. The corruption was gone. This was memory. My memory now, written into me by the simulation with the fidelity of something I had experienced personally, because I had. I had stood in Aldesi's corridor and counted his patients and sent his request and absorbed the denial. I knew what the compliance broadcast sounded like from the receiving end. The specific weight of hearing an empire tell you that your world belonged to someone else, that your timeline was non-negotiable, that your patients would receive medical support upon landing from men who had never seen palethic equipment. I closed my mouth. The order stayed where it was. Reports arrived from the fleet by text channel. Senior officers across all 42 ships were reporting similar conditions. Simulation chambers had activated autonomously during the Silhouette's presence. Command staff above the rank of lieutenant had experienced the same forced perspective. Conquered worlds rendered from the inside. Each campaign matched to the officers who had participated in it. Rank markers and authorization implants had been extracted. Junior officers were assuming temporary command across the fleet. The ship's surgeon sent a report on Drayton. He was in the medical bay, physically uninjured, responding to his own name and following simple instructions. He ate when given food, he drank when given water. When asked anything about fleet operations, tactical assessment, or chain of command, he began speaking in Gorith. Fluent Gorith, the translation system confirmed, a language Drayton had never studied, delivered in the cadence of the surrender negotiator whose words had replaced his on the bridge. The surgeon asked what to do. I did not have an answer. Foss had sealed himself in the simulation chamber. Through the intercom, I could hear him working, components being removed, sorted, catalogued. He was dismantling the simulation system piece by piece and filing a damage report for each component in the format used for decommissioned weapons. He was treating the machine as an instrument of harm. He was doing this with steady hands and precise technical language, and he was doing it alone because nobody had ordered him to do it, and nobody had told him to stop. My journal lay on the deck near my command chair, where it had fallen during the tribunal. I picked it up and opened it to the Paleth page. My handwriting, my column headers, my operational shorthand clipped and professional. Compliance time 0340. Governance landing 0400. Medical district secured 0600. Integration timeline nominal. 6 words for 900 patients. A 4-digit timestamp 0340. For the moment, Aldesi Govanath watched soldiers enter his corridor and begin disconnecting equipment they had not been trained to operate. Integration timeline nominal for the 17 critical patients who died in the first 72 hours. A number I had never asked for because the mandate's reporting structure did not require it. I knew it now because the simulation had placed it in Aldesi's hands as he wrote his own report in a temporary office the governance team had assigned him in a building that had been his 3 days earlier. I turned to the blank page I had prepared for Kereth 4. I picked up the pen clipped inside the journal's binding. I wrote a name. Aldesi Govanath. Full Palethic spelling, which I should not have known and now could not forget. Below it, Edda Kos. The Gorith negotiator whose word for gift had broken in his mouth. Below that, Belar Kos. The Tanith supervisor who had watched his grandfather's work catalogued as recovered infrastructure material. I kept writing. The simulation had given me others. Fragments of names, partial identities, faces attached to specific losses. A Vashar teacher whose school became a processing center. A Pelham council member whose legal terminology was erased in translation. A dock supervisor from Marek, whose title I wrote phonetically because I had heard it only once, inside the simulation, in a room I had never physically entered. I wrote what I had and left gaps for the names I could not reconstruct. Blank spaces in a journal that had never contained a blank space before. Because my column headers had always been full, and my data had always been complete, and I had never once recorded the name of a person my data described. The page filled. I turned to the next one and continued. Kiho appeared beside my chair. Sir, the fleet is awaiting instructions. Central Command has not responded to the distress signal. All ships are reporting senior command staff non-functional. Junior officers are requesting guidance. He paused. What should we do? Not, what are your orders, General? He had not called me General. The absence was small. It changed the temperature of the bridge. I looked at him, at his unburned uniform, his intact implant, the sidearm still properly angled at his hip. He was young enough to believe a system could be shocked into confessing what it was. Or perhaps he was young enough to try before the system taught him not to. Set course for Terran space, I said. And the Kereth 4 operation? I looked at the viewport. Kereth 4 hung in the middle distance, green and blue and brown, its tidal settlements visible along the equatorial coastline, 800 million people going about the business of a world that had never built a weapon. The compliance broadcast waited in its queue. The governance teams waited in their ships. The 40-hour window waited to begin. Cancel the broadcast. Kehoe did not move. The bridge was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation. Sir, he said carefully, the Bureau package is locked under campaign authorization. My authorization implant is on the deck. Yes. Then use yours. His eyes flicked to the compliance queue, to the Kereth translation file, to the distress channel still open to the sector relay. What do you want transmitted? I looked down at the journal, at the names, at the column headers above them, useless now as measurement, useful only as indictment. The bridge logs, I said. The communications corruption logs, the medical bay reports, every simulation record that survived Foss's damage. Append them to the distress signal and send them through every sector relay that will accept the packet. Central Command, Contact Bureau, Parliament Oversight, Fleet Archive, civilian courier bands if you can reach them. Kehoe's hands were already moving. And Kereth? He asked. I looked back at the planet. The mandate had prepared one message for them, one official voice telling them that their world had been designated for incorporation and that compliance would preserve life and infrastructure. I could still hear the Paleth administrator reading our promises from the other side. Send them a warning, I said. Native language format. Strip out the Imperial seal and authority statement. What should it say? I closed the journal. Tell them we came to take their world. Tell them we were stopped. Tell them another fleet may come. Kehoe waited. Then he said, And the rest? I looked at him. He did not look away. The rest is yours, Lieutenant. For a moment he was only 23 years old, sitting at a communications station in the aftermath of something no academy had trained him to understand. Then he turned back to the console and began typing. I watched the first line appear in Kerethic script, translated by the same Bureau system that had prepared our compliance demand. Plain warning, stripped of conquest language and mandate phrasing. Kehoe sent it open channel. Then he moved to the helm and entered the navigation commands. The fleet turned. 42 warships, fully armed, carrying a vanguard command staff that could not issue orders without hearing the price of every order it had ever given, pulled away from a world they had come to take. Kereth 4 shrank in the viewport. Kereth Prime burned behind it, stable and ordinary, as if nothing had lived near its surface, as if the crown had never formed. I sat in my chair and wrote names in my journal. The pen moved steadily. The pages turned. The column headers I had used for 22 years, compliance time, governance landing, integration phase, notable resistance, sat at the top of each page like headstones for a language I had spoken fluently and could no longer use. Below them, in the space where operational data should have been, I wrote what the data had cost. A medical administrator's 12-hour request, a linguist's broken word, an engineer's stolen seawall, and the names of the people who had carried those losses, while I carried my rank. The fleet withdrew toward Terran space. Central Command would eventually respond to the distress signal or to the absence of a compliance report from Kereth 4, or to the unauthorized return of 42 armed ships under junior command. There would be a review. There would be questions. Officers with intact implants and unspoiled uniforms would sit across a table from me and ask me to explain what had happened in the Kereth system. I would tell them, and many of them would classify my testimony as evidence of psychological compromise. They might bury the records. They might reassign the fleet to a commander who had never met the beings who rested near stars. They might dispatch another vanguard to Kereth and call the first attempt an aberration, a failure of nerve, a contamination event. I knew this. I wrote another name. The journal was filling with a record the mandate had no column for, no reporting structure to receive, no classification system to contain. Kehoe's transmission was moving ahead of us through the relay network, carrying logs the Empire would try to seal, and a warning the Kereth might not understand until warships returned to their sky. It was the heaviest thing I had ever carried. It might make no difference to anyone with the authority to stop what was coming. I wrote another name, then another. The fleet moved through the dark between stars and the pages turned.